morning, everyone. How are you? It is such a pleasure to be here. Thanks. This is my husband, Dr. Bobby Carter. Yes, he has the same degree as me. He's a copycat. So, first and foremost, I want to say thank you to Pete and Foster and John for allowing me to share with you, and thank you for not walking out just yet, and just listening. Because here's the thing, I know we're in the holiday season, and a lot of times the holiday can be real tricky, especially when you're in transition, when you're waiting for that call or you're looking for that email. It feels like time goes really, really slow. And the holidays can feel like being stuck over someone's house who can't cook, and you didn't you didn't drive, so now you got to grit and bear through it, and the only thing that tastes good is the crackers. It kind of feels like that, right? But in order to get started, I need you to do me a favor. Just for a second, I need you to close your eyes. And as your eyes are closed, I want you to think about a leader that has had the most impact on your life. It can be professionally, it can be personally, but just get a picture of that leader in your head. And when you have that leader, I want you to think, what would happen if they never showed up? What would happen if they were held back by their own limitations or the comfort or stagnation? Or what if they were held back by limiting narratives? What would your life be like right now? And as you open your eyes, I'm pretty sure many of you are like me, where you're grateful. You're grateful that they pushed past. You're grateful that they were willing to step out and fight and be an example. And so what we're going to talk about today is a couple of things. We're going to talk about limiting narratives. We're going to talk about understanding their impact. Then we're going to talk about how to identify them, how to challenge them, so that ultimately you can rewrite your own leadership story. Because when you think about that leader, here's a question I have. Is someone waiting for you to show up? I'm not talking about the current iteration of you. I'm talking about that next level of you. That level of you that you might not have seen yet, but that God called you to be before the foundations of the world. And oftentimes, there's a limiting narrative that begins to build up a big blockade that stops us from really becoming. God usually uses seasons like this to bring certain things to our attention. You know, there's this story, and it's about a guy. He actually faced, let's just say, some extreme workplace issues. Some of you may know him. He is Daniel. Because when you think about the story of Daniel, his co-workers tried to get him, as what I like to call, aggressively fired. Now, it's a little different, right? They actually tried to get him killed, but essentially it's getting fired. Because what they did is they took what he was doing and they twisted it. And even when his boss tried to find a way to save him, he couldn't because of the red tape or office politics. And many of us sometimes find ourselves, especially in this season, caught up in that type of red tape. And so Daniel's upstairs. He's doing what God asked him to do. He's praying. He's working in excellence. That's Daniel's whole story. He worked in excellence. But yet, he finds himself being snatched out of his room and thrown. Now, anybody that's over 35 knows that being thrown, you don't just recoup off of that, like maybe when you were younger. And we also know that feeling thrown and being thrown is not like getting a hug. So he was thrown down into a pit for something that he didn't really do. Now, I know we all know that God shut the mouth of the lion, and we oftentimes fast forward to that. But the part that sometimes we miss and we skip is the fact that Daniel actually was in this really sticky waiting season. Because if you read the story, it says that once he was thrown in, the king had to roll a stone over the mouth of the den to ensure that no one could help him. And sometimes that's how we feel when we're in transition. I'm doing the things, I'm doing this, I'm tweaking my resume, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm doing all I know how to do, and why does it feel like no one can help me? And so Daniel finds himself in this den. And while he's in the den, yes, we know the angel of the Lord was there shutting his mouth. If you're like me, I would have been like, okay, that's great. We've been here for about an hour. Maybe we can roll this stone away and I can go back to what I was doing. Because that's how we feel. Waiting sucks. Doesn't feel good. And what happens sometimes when we're waiting, thoughts start to pick up in our mind. And sometimes God likes to use waiting in order to show us what's happening and what's been happening underneath the surface that we perhaps haven't been paying attention to because we've been on survival mode, we've been on conquer mode. And so there are things that he's had to yell that he should have only had to whisper. And so he uses a waiting season to get our attention. Now, here's the thing. Like I said, I'm not that great with waiting. But this here is my mom. And so I know a little bit about how waiting can trigger certain fears, certain worries. It can bring the past to the present. In fact, it can reveal to you that the past has been driving your car the whole entire time. And the reason why I know is because of my past. I'm a child abuse survivor. And this here is my mom. She had me when she was 15 years old. My dad was considerably older than her. And she thought that she was going to fall in love, have this family. But unfortunately, before she knew it, she found herself, this young girl from Miami, in a very bitter custody battle. My dad, in an effort to look like he had the more stable home, he met someone quickly and they got married. And so my stepmom and my dad raised me. But the problem was, they started to tell me, your mom didn't want you. She had no interest in being a mother. She wanted to be young, wild, and free, except they left the young part out. They told me she never fought for me. And so very early on, I had feelings of abandonment, rejection, and all of these things. And then on top of that, I'm facing the abuse at home. It's not just belts. I got my head pushed into a porcelain bowl. And so as a young child, I'm like, who's gonna come and save me? Ooh, I have one more hope left, and that's her. She'll come and get me. But unfortunately, by the time my mom hit 24, she was gone. And I felt like my heart left with her. And so very early on, I felt hopeless. And there was a lot, let me back up for you. There were a lot of narratives that were painted very early on that were sitting in the driver's seat, having me think, okay, who my stepmother and my dad and who my grandparents and my friends, who they said I am must be who I am. I am here to play support. I'm here to merely exist. I'm here to play the background. And so as I grew up, of course, you get into your work life, you come out of that and you feel like, okay, I'm not there physically anymore. I should be fine. But here's what I didn't realize. What I didn't realize is the things that you go through in your personal life, they don't just stay in the nice little pretty Pinterest boxes. They actually hop out like an unruly toddler that follows you around the house, and they follow you into your work, impacting what I call your leadership echo. And what your leadership echo is, it's not just who you impact close to you, it's who you impact far-reaching from you. Because the Bible says, as a man thinks, so is he. And so depending on who's sitting and whose voice is in the command center of your control tower, it will dictate your movements, your behaviors, how you see yourself, how you engage with others. You know, one of the things that I realized is that all of those thoughts about not being enough, about being built for rejection and abandonment and all those things, I really thought that that was me. And come to find out, let's see, it wasn't true. And so some of the things that I adapted once I got into corporate, right? Because I'm thinking, okay, that's behind me now. I don't have to worry about that. And then I got into corporate, and leadership started automatically rising up out of me. But just like the leadership instinct was automatic, so was this narrative that said you need to hide. Because being seen is going to make you a target. Because that's what I grew up learning, that being seen will make me a target. So I had to find a way to get both instincts to play nice, because they were both equally strong. It's not like one dominated the other. And so I came up subconsciously with this persona, thinking that, oh, this is what it might be, that I was the silent leader. I would tell people, listen, I am the undercurrent. I'm not the wave. I'm not the one you see just big and booming. You may not see me, but you'll feel me. And it sounds good. Problem is, it's not true. The problem is that honestly, I was afraid of being the full body of water. I was afraid of walking in the fullness and the totality of the power that God gave me. Fear was my driver. Another way that the things that I went through started showing up was I felt like I had to get everything right. I had to cross every T, dot every I, couldn't drop a ball, couldn't make mistakes. I was high off of perfectionism. But the truth of the matter was, me trying to be perfect was me trying to outrun my own feelings of unworthiness. And so I did in order to make myself feel better. And so what I learned as I started going to therapy and God started really directing me to resources is that actually there's two forms of authenticity. In fact, humanistic psychologists have found that there are two forms of authenticity. And oftentimes we think of authenticity very superficially, right? Like, I like nails, I like tattoos, I like motorcycles. We keep it very superficial, but it's actually way more detailed than that. In fact, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum, and so the two forms of authenticity, there's a good form, a healthy form, and then there is a distorted, unhealthy form. And so what happens when you are operating in that good form, you're able to be reflective, you're able to accept the good and the parts that you need to work on. You don't ruminate over your missteps. There's positive self-talk inside of your mind. But most of all, you are able to live out the values that you have from within. You're not easily influenced by the voice of another, whether that be the voice of your parents, a sibling, an ex. No, you're able to know who you are and be rooted in that. You're open to new experiences, but still you know who you are. That not so good version, the unhealthy version, the maladaptive version, that version is distorted because it tells you you're not, you can't, you'll never be. It leads to a lot of psychological distress. It causes you to be very rigid and black and white in your thinking because you don't think much of yourself and you don't think much of the world around you, and so therefore you don't think much could ever change. And the problem with that is that it causes us to really believe this is who we are. You really believe that's you. But what if I told you it's a distortion? It's not the clear picture of you. It's like driving in your car and your windshield is shattered in the front. You're not going to accurately be able to see what's in front of you. And so it's the same thing. My husband, he has an eye condition. It's called keratoconus. And so when he doesn't have his superhuman eye contacts in, his phone is right here, like he can't see at all. And so I remember when we first went to the eye doctor, and we chose the lenses. It's a special type of lenses. And when he put them on, it was so amazing to see him be able to see for the first time. He was blinking, and he was like, "That was always there?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Oh, and you have a chin hair." And I was like, "Whoa." I didn't ask you to see that. Take the contacts out, right? But oftentimes, that's what happens when we change our perspective of ourselves for God's. We're able to see with clarity rather than a blurred picture. So here's the thing. Those limiting narratives, that's a great picture of what they feel like a trap. But I have a video that I want to share to really give you a stronger imagery. You know, I grew up in the 90s, and there used to be this anti-drug commercial where the guy cracks an egg, and he goes, "This is your brain." And then he puts it in the fryer and he goes, "This is your brain on drugs." And it starts frying and you're like, "Oh my God, that's my brain. Okay, I'll stay away." I don't know how successful I was during college, but God forgave me. And so I want to show you this video. Perfect. Thank you. What did you notice about that bug on the paper? Did you notice that every time unknown person drew a line, the bug would divert because it would think that there's a barrier there? But here's the question. Was the barrier real? No. It was perceived. Also, when you look at the bug's movements, it looks really erratic. Because when you are being driven by a limiting narrative, it causes certain behaviors. Like I said, as a man thinks, so is he. And so what happens is it causes you to undercompensate and overcompensate. And I know some of you are taking pictures, and I'll move out of the way. But when we are overcompensating because we're being driven by a limiting narrative, what happens is it can cause us to be like how I did, perfectionism, right? I'm trying to be overly perfect, over attention to detail because I don't want to get it wrong and I don't want to be seen as wrong. It can cause you to even be a micromanager because you're afraid of losing control, because maybe there was a time you didn't have control and you said, "That will never happen to me again." It can make you be overly authoritarian at times too, because you will always maintain respect at all costs. It can cause undercompensation, where you begin to lose your voice because you're afraid of confrontation. It can cause you to be indecisive. It can cause so many things, and a lot of times because we're human and we're complex beings, we take a little bit of both, depending on the situation. But the problem is, at the root of all of it is fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of being incompetent, fear. Hold on. Trying to get this to work. All right, we're just going to keep going. But nevertheless, when you over or undercompensate, it ends up having an impact on who you are as a leader. And so this is why it is so important when it comes to limiting narratives that you treat it kind of like a crime scene documentary. Anybody ever watch crime scene documentaries where they have the perpetrator and they got to find out and all of the things? They're really great to watch right before you go to bed. It's awesome. Great experience. But the thing is that you have to treat it like a crime documentary so you can find out whose voice is it. You know, when you think about the garden, going back to the fall of Adam and Eve, one of the first questions that God asked Adam, "Who told you you were naked?" And so that's where you have to sometimes question, who told me I wasn't enough? Where did I get that from? And so In order to really begin to break it down, you want to identify your limiting narratives, challenge them, and ultimately rewrite your story. And the way that you do that is through this framework that I created called Reveal. And so we'll go through some of those steps in more detail. And so the first part is to recognize your limiting narratives. And so when you're recognizing them, you have to start to ask yourself very specific questions. You have to start looking at your entire life pattern. And you got to look at your thought pattern. It's called metacognition, when you think about your thinking. And so in order to recognize them, first start looking at your triggers. What are the things that tend to trigger you, that cause almost like an automatic reaction? Is that the first time it's triggered you? Do you see any similarities with these triggers? The next thing you need to think about is, what are the emotions that you feel when you're triggered? Are you sad? Are you angry? Are you disappointed? What is it you're feeling? Sometimes you may even have to simply go on the internet and look up feelings chart, because there's a plethora of feelings that sometimes we don't really recall. Sometimes we just recall, hey, I'm angry, or hey, I'm sad. But if you really sit with it for a second, you might find that there's some more complex feelings going on. The other thing you want to look at is, when you are triggered and you have this feeling, what behavior do you find yourself enacting? Do you find yourself overcompensating, undercompensating? Do you find yourself misidentifying? A great example of this is, I have a fear, a very strong fear of snakes. And so if we're walking, if I'm not careful, I can be far away and I can see a stick or a twig, and my heart will start to race, and I'll just go the other way. But the thing is that it wasn't a snake, it was just a twig. And so when you have the wrong thing driving you, it can cause you to misinterpret or misperceive certain situations where that may not be the case. It might have been the case once upon a time, but it doesn't mean it's the case now. And so as you look through the trigger and you look through the behavior and you look through the emotion, try to narrow down, what is the narrative saying? Is it saying I'm not good enough? Is it saying you're going to be rejected? Is it saying you can't trust these people? What is it saying? And then after that, you need to examine. But when I say examine, I mean like cross-examine, really interrogate the narrative. Because you got to find out, well, when's the first time I heard this narrative? How far does this go back? And who's the author? Because for me, a lot of times, the limiting things that I heard in my head, it was from my childhood. And so when you know who the source is, you can better address it, because you can't change what you don't identify. And so that's why it's so important to start out with fully identifying who's in the driver's seat, who takes over when you get triggered. What is that? The next thing you need to do is you're going to have to validate with the truth. Because what happens is there are times where those limiting narratives are telling you all of these things, a whole plethora of things. But if you run your track record, it's actually not true. A great example is, growing up, I used to not be the best when it came to spelling, and me and punctuations were never friends. And so as I got older, I was like, man, I could never be an author. There's no way I could be an author. And I just kept thinking, no, you can't, even though you have a story to tell, you can't. And then I started going through my own journey and process of challenging and identifying narratives. And then it dawned on me, well, Brenda, what does your track record say? Well, you got through a whole master's degree. You've done 11 presentations for corporate, from VPs to C-suite to board to managers. I think you might be able to do a little something. You wrote a 250-page dissertation with your nails. You just might be able to write a story. And guess what? They have a thing called an editor. Go figure. So I don't have to be perfect at that part because there's someone else for that. And so that's what I mean when I say validate with the truth. Now, this next one, embrace with self-compassion. Here's the reason why you have to do that. The limiting narratives are already harsh enough. They already speak these lofty words that you'll never be able to conquer, it feels. So you have to have self-compassion the entire journey through. And I want you to remember something. The voice of God is never hopeless. So even when you are identifying these limiting narratives, sometimes when he says, my sheep know my voice, the voice that you hear, if it sounds hopeless, it's not him. If it brings confusion, it's not him. If it brings chaos, it's not him. And you have to know that. The next step that I always say you have to do, and this is, you got to forgive me for a second. I grew up in New York during the era of gangster rap. And so when I say ask your squad to help you jump, I'm not talking inspirationally, like help me jump from one spot to the other, to the next level. No. Jump is a fight term. So what it means is if I go somewhere and 3 or 4 people beat me up, I got jumped. What I'm telling you to do is you need to jump your narrative. You need to ask your squad, get squatted up. So first, go to the great I am, because can't nobody defeat him. His record is unmatched. So you go to him first and you ask him to lead you and guide you. And who should you get to help you defeat the enemy and the tapes playing in your mind? Then you can get your therapist and you can ask him to lead you to the right one, and your community and your faith and different books. You have to get more people and more resources on your side, because you fighting it alone, it's always been stronger than you. So leverage these resources to help jump that narrative, to beat it down. All of those years that it beat you down, I think you deserve your lick back, as the young kids say. And so you got to treat it like that, just as aggressively. And then next, I want you to leap. I want you to leap. I want you, once you finally have those limiting narratives under your feet, I want you to re-explore. There are some things you will need to revisit, and then there are other things you'll need to explore. Because when you go to leap, when you go to rewrite and do something different, you're going to build another track record in your own mind. You're going to create a new story. You're going to build new habits. You're going to be able to change the I can't to I can. Wait a minute, I did. Okay, let's do it again. And it builds and it builds and it builds. And you end up becoming very sure. You transition from that distorted version of you to that clear version of you. And oh, imagine the impact you could have when you're in that clear version. It's nothing like being able to walk in inner authority after you can tell for so long you've been driven by the voice of someone else. There's nothing like freedom. He who the Son set free is free indeed. So that's why it's important to leap. And so what I want you to do, I want everybody to close their eyes again. And I want you to imagine you are Caleb. You're on the precipice of walking into the promised land. And as Caleb, you no longer see yourself as a grasshopper, but you see yourself as more than a conqueror. And now, I want you to switch that thought, and I want you to think about, imagine you being in a room filled with people, and they're being asked, who's the leader that has inspired and impacted you the most? And imagine your name being said multiple times. As you open your eyes, I want you to think, what did you do differently? How did you show up differently? What was it? What did you overcome? Was there something, a new venture that you did? How did you transform in your being? Because whatever it is, that is what you're going to need in order to go to that next level. That is how you rewrite your story. You know, for me, even becoming an author and eventually walking into leadership, I realized it was there all along. I just hadn't found it yet. And in fact, some of the people who I might not have necessarily gotten along with and I felt like they used me and abused me, they saw it well before I did. And so there comes a time where God says it's time to come out. I'm going to roll away the stone. And I need you to walk in the fullness of who you are. And while we are in this waiting period, we're waiting for the calls to come back. We feel like the lions are roaring, and we're like, Jesus, you sure you shut their mouths? Because I'm still hearing. While we're waiting, you got to understand you're still protected. God still got you. In fact, if you touch your other arm, you'll see you're still here. Now watch this. How many of you have ever felt in times past that this was going to be the big one, where you didn't know how you was going to make it, and you had some type of situation where you're like, Lord, if you don't get me out of this, I don't know how I will. Show of hands. How many of you ever felt like that? How many of you ever felt like that more than once? Right. But guess what? You're still here. You know, sometimes I'm a little melodramatic. I'm like Fred Sanford and Son. I know I'm dating myself, but I'm like, this is the big one, Elizabeth. This is the big one, right? That's how we feel. Like, this is going to be that big one. This is going to be the one that takes me out. But it's not. God is faithful. And just like he's been faithful in the past, I promise you he's going to be faithful again. Thank you.